The small town of Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, was known for its picturesque charm and tight-knit community. At the heart of this idyllic setting stood Sarah's Cafe, a cozy establishment run by Sarah Thompson, a woman in her mid-30s with a warm smile and a knack for brewing the perfect cup of coffee. Every morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Sarah would unlock the cafe's doors, filling the air with the rich aroma of freshly ground beans and warm pastries. On a crisp autumn morning, as Sarah wiped down the counter and prepared for the day's first customers, she noticed something unusual through the cafe's large front window. A golden retriever, his coat shimmering in the early morning light, trotted purposefully down Main Street. Sarah recognized the dog as Max, belonging to old Mr. Johnson, who lived on the outskirts of town. What caught her attention, however, was not Max's presence, it was his destination. With unwavering focus, Max made his way to the town's small cemetery, just visible from Sarah's vantage point. She watched, puzzled, as the dog navigated through the iron gates and wove between the weathered headstones. Finally, Max came to a stop in front of a particular grave, where he sat down, his tail curled neatly around his paws. Sarah's curiosity was piqued. She had never seen a dog behave this way, especially not on a daily basis. As the weeks passed, she observed Max's routine, marveling at his punctuality and dedication. Every morning, without fail, the golden retriever would make his pilgrimage to the cemetery, always to the same grave. One slow afternoon, Sarah decided to investigate further. Leaving her assistant, Jake, in charge of the cafe, she made her way to the cemetery. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet as she walked the familiar path to the grave where Max spent his mornings. As she approached, she noticed the name etched into the weathered stone: Emily Richardson, beloved daughter and friend, 1990 to 2018. Sarah's heart tightened as she remembered Emily. A vibrant young woman, full of life and loved by everyone in Millbrook. Her tragic death in a car accident 2 years ago had left the entire town in mourning. But what was Max's connection to Emily? Lost in thought, Sarah almost missed the small object partially buried near the headstone. Kneeling down, she gently brushed away the fallen leaves and loose soil, revealing a faded red collar. Her fingers traced the worn leather, finding a tarnished tag that read Max on one side and Emily on the other. The pieces started to fall into place. Emily must have been Max's owner, and the loyal dog was still visiting her grave every day. Sarah's eyes welled with tears at the thought of such unwavering devotion. As she stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, Sarah heard a familiar bark. She turned to see Max bounding towards her, his tail wagging furiously. Mr. Johnson followed close behind, slightly out of breath from trying to keep up with his energetic companion. "Oh, hello there, Sarah," Mr. Johnson wheezed, leaning on his cane. "I see you've met my Maximum, quite the character, isn't he?" Sarah smiled, reaching down to pat Max's head. "He certainly is, Mr. Johnson. I couldn't help but notice his daily visits here. Did you know Emily?" Mr. Johnson's weathered face softened with a mix of sadness and fondness. "Ah, yes. Emily was my granddaughter. She and Max were inseparable. When she passed, it nearly broke my heart to see how lost Max was without her. I took him in, of course, but every day he'd run off. Took me a while to figure out where he was going." As Mr. Johnson spoke, Max settled himself in his usual spot by Emily's grave, his eyes fixed on the headstone as if he could see beyond it to the girl he loved. "It's remarkable," Sarah mused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Such loyalty, even after all this time." Mr. Johnson nodded, his eyes misty. "Dogs have a way of loving that puts us humans to shame sometimes. Max here, he's teaching me a thing or two about holding on to the good memories instead of just the pain of losing her." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had known Emily, served her countless lattes and shared laughs over the counter, but she had never known the depth of the young woman's impact on those around her, not just people, but animals too. As they stood there, the autumn breeze rustling through the trees, Sarah felt a shift in her perspective. The daily routine she had observed from afar was more than just a curious animal behavior, it was a testament to love, loyalty, and the enduring bonds that defied even death. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the little details of life in Millbrook. She noticed the way Mrs. Peterson always saved a piece of her morning muffin for the sparrows that gathered outside the cafe. She saw how Tom, the mailman, would go out of his way to deliver packages personally to old Mrs. Collins, who had trouble walking to her mailbox. These small acts of kindness and connection seemed to take on a new significance in light of Max's devotion. Sarah began to wonder about Emily's life, the impact she had made in her short time, and the ripples that were still spreading through the community. One morning, as Sarah was setting up the cafe's outdoor seating area, she overheard a conversation between two high school students. "Did you hear about the Emily Richardson Memorial Scholarship?" one girl asked excitedly. "They're looking for volunteers to help organize the fundraising event." Her friend nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I heard it's going to be huge this year. They want to raise enough money to send 2 students to college instead of just 1. Sarah's ears perked up at this. She had heard of the scholarship before but hadn't paid much attention to it. Now, with Max's story fresh in her mind, she felt compelled to learn more. Later that day, during a lull in the cafe, Sarah did some research on her laptop. She discovered that the Emily Richardson Memorial Scholarship had been established by Emily's parents shortly after her death. It was awarded annually to a Millbrook High School student who exemplified Emily's spirit of community service and academic excellence. Inspired, Sarah decided to reach out to the organizers and offer her cafe as a venue for their next planning meeting. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a way to honor both Emily's memory and the lesson of connection that Max had unwittingly taught her. As word spread about the upcoming scholarship event, Sarah noticed a change in the atmosphere of her cafe. Customers lingered longer, engaged in animated discussions about fundraising ideas and sharing stories about Emily. Even those who hadn't known her personally seemed touched by the legacy she had left behind. One afternoon, as Sarah was clearing tables, she overheard a group of elderly women reminiscing. "You know, I still expect to see Emily bouncing through that door some days," Mrs. Fitzgerald said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "She always had a kind word for everyone, no matter how busy she was." Her friend, Mrs. Donovan, nodded in agreement. "Remember how she organized that cleanup day for the park? Got half the town out there picking up trash and planting flowers. The place has never looked better." Sarah smiled to herself, feeling a connection to Emily that she had never experienced when the young woman was alive. Through the stories shared by her customers and Max's unwavering devotion, Emily's spirit seemed to permeate the very fabric of Millbrook. As the days grew shorter and the air crisper, Sarah found herself looking forward to Max's daily visits to the cemetery. She would wave to Mr. Johnson as he slowly made his way down the street, Max trotting faithfully by his side. Sometimes, when the cafe wasn't too busy, she would take a moment to walk over and join them, sharing a quiet moment of remembrance. One particularly chilly morning, Sarah arrived at the cafe to find a small group gathered outside the cemetery gates. Curious, she approached, recognizing several faces from town. "What's going on?" she asked, pulling her coat tighter around her. Lisa, the local florist, turned to her with a smile. "We're going to clean up the cemetery today. Some of the older graves have gotten a bit overgrown, and with the scholarship event coming up, we thought it would be nice to spruce the place up a bit." Sarah's heart warmed at the spontaneous show of community spirit. Without hesitation, she offered to provide coffee and pastries for the volunteers. As she hurried back to the cafe to gather supplies, she couldn't help but feel that this, too, was part of Emily's legacy. Bringing people together, fostering a sense of care for their shared spaces and history. Throughout the day, Sarah watched from the cafe window as the group worked tirelessly, raking leaves, trimming overgrown bushes, and straightening tilted headstones. Max and Mr. Johnson were there too, the old man offering directions while Max seemed to supervise, his tail wagging in approval. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Main Street, the volunteers made their way to the cafe, cheeks ruddy from the cold and exertion. Sarah welcomed them with steaming mugs of cocoa and a spread of sandwiches she had quickly prepared. The cafe buzzed with conversation and laughter as the group recounted their day's work. Sarah moved among them, refilling mugs and basking in the warmth of community. She caught snippets of conversation, plans for future projects, ideas for the scholarship fundraiser, and more stories about Emily. As the last of the volunteers trickled out, Sarah began to clean up. She paused by the window, looking out at the now tidy cemetery bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Max and Mr. Johnson were making their final visit of the day to Emily's grave. In that moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of connection, to Emily, to Max, to every person in Millbrook who had been touched by this story of love and loyalty. She realized that the enigmatic behavior she had first observed weeks ago was more than just a curious habit of a grieving dog. It was a reminder of the invisible threads that bound their community together, a testament to the enduring power of love and memory. As she turned off the cafe lights and locked the door, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to Emily's memory. She would do her part to keep that spirit of connection and community alive in Millbrook, one cup of coffee and one act of kindness at a time. As autumn gave way to winter in Millbrook, Sarah found herself increasingly intrigued by Emily Richardson's story. The upcoming scholarship fundraiser had sparked a renewed interest in the young woman's life throughout the town, and Sarah's cafe had become an unofficial hub for sharing memories and stories. One snowy morning, as Sarah was arranging a display of freshly baked muffins, the cafe door opened with a gust of cold air. Tom, the town's longtime groundskeeper, stomped the snow from his boots and made his way to the counter. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "Got any of that cinnamon coffee today?" Sarah smiled, already reaching for a mug. "Just brewed a fresh pot, Tom. How are things at the cemetery?" Tom's weathered face creased with concern. "Actually, that's why I'm here. Thought you might want to know, given your interest in the Richardson girls' story." Sarah leaned in, curiosity piqued. "What's going on, Tom?" The old groundskeeper sighed, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm mug. "You know that dog, Max? The one that visits every day?" Sarah nodded, and Tom continued, "Well, he's been digging. Nothing too destructive, mind you, but enough to catch my attention. And yesterday, I found something odd." Sarah's eyes widened. "Odd how?" Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. "Found this partially buried near Emily's headstone. Looks old, but I don't reckon it's been there since the burial. Thought maybe you might know what to make of it." Sarah carefully took the locket, turning it over in her hands. It was heart-shaped, with intricate engravings that had been worn smooth in places. Try as she might, she couldn't get it to open. "Have you shown this to Mr. Johnson?" Sarah asked, still examining the locket. Tom shook his head. "Not yet. Figured I'd ask around first, see if anyone knew anything about it. Didn't want to upset the old man if it turned out to be nothing." Sarah nodded, understanding Tom's caution. Mr. Johnson had been through enough pain with the loss of his granddaughter. "Leave it with me," she said. "I'll do some digging, figuratively speaking, of course." As Tom left, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this locket was more than just a random trinket. She spent the rest of the morning distracted, her mind buzzing with questions. Who did the locket belong to? Why was it buried by Emily's grave? And what, if anything, did it have to do with Emily's story? During the lunch rush, Sarah overheard a conversation that caught her attention. Two women, probably in their 50s, were discussing Emily. "You know, I always wondered about that summer she spent in Europe," one woman said. "She came back, different somehow. More serious." Her friend nodded. "I remember that. It was right before she started getting involved in all those community projects, wasn't it?" Sarah's ears perked up. She had never heard about Emily's trip to Europe. As she refilled their coffee cups, she couldn't help but ask, "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing. You knew Emily Richardson?" The women smiled, introducing themselves as Carol and Linda, former teachers at Millbrook High. "Oh yes," Carol said. "Emily was a special one. Bright, kind, always looking out for others. But that summer in Europe, it changed her." Linda nodded in agreement. She never talked much about it, but you could see it in her eyes. Like she'd seen something that opened them to the bigger world out there. Sarah hesitated for a moment before pulling out the locket. "I don't suppose either of you recognizes this. It was found near Emily's grave." The women examined the locket, their faces creasing in concentration. "Can't say that I do," Carol said. "But you know who might." "Melissa Parker." She and Emily were best friends. Thick as thieves, those two. Linda snapped her fingers. That's right. Melissa moved away after what happened to Emily. Last I heard, she was living in Albany. Runs some kind of non-profit, I think. Sarah thanked the women, her mind racing with this new information. As soon as she had a break, she ducked into the back office and fired up her computer. A quick search for Melissa Parker Albany non-profit yielded results. Melissa was the director of a foundation that provided art therapy for at-risk youth. Without hesitation, Sarah sent an email to the foundation, explaining her connection to Millbrook and her interest in Emily's story. She attached a photo of the locket, hoping it might jog Melissa's memory. To her surprise, a response came within the hour. Melissa's email was brief but intriguing. Sarah, thank you for reaching out. That locket. I never thought I'd see it again. I'm coming to Millbrook this weekend. Can we meet? The next few days passed in a blur of anticipation. Sarah found herself distracted, her eyes constantly drawn to the cemetery across the street. She watched as Max continued his daily visits, wondering if the loyal dog somehow knew more than he was letting on. Saturday morning arrived with a fresh blanket of snow. Sarah opened the cafe early, her nerves jangling with excitement and apprehension. At precisely 9 a.m., the door opened, and a woman with auburn hair and kind eyes stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. Sarah, she asked, looking around the cozy space. Sarah nodded, extending her hand. You must be Melissa. It's so nice to meet you. They settled into a quiet corner of the cafe, steaming mugs of coffee between them. Melissa held the locket in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn engravings. I can't believe you found this, she said softly. Emily and we bought matching lockets on our trip to Prague the summer before she died. It was supposed to be a symbol of our friendship, a reminder of the promises we made to each other. Sarah leaned in, her voice gentle. What kind of promises? Melissa took a deep breath, her eyes misting with memories. We discovered something that summer, Sarah. Something big. Emily, she always had a nose for injustice, you know? We were just a couple of small-town girls on a European adventure, but somehow we stumbled onto this network. Network? Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. Melissa nodded, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Art smugglers. Big operations, moving stolen pieces across borders. We saw things, overheard conversations we shouldn't have. At first, we thought it was exciting, like something out of a movie. But then we realized how serious it was. Sarah's mind was reeling. This was far beyond anything she had imagined when she first noticed Max's daily visits to the cemetery. Did you go to the authorities? Melissa shook her head, a rueful smile on her face. We were young, scared. We didn't know who to trust. So we made a pact. We would gather evidence, build a case. The lockets, they were more than just friendship tokens. They contained microSD cards with everything we had collected. Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. And Emily kept investigating when you got back to Millbrook. She did, Melissa confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. I went off to college, tried to put it behind me. But Emily, she couldn't let it go. She kept digging, kept gathering information. She said she was close to cracking it wide open, and then, the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on Melissa's arm. The accident, she said softly. Melissa nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I always wondered if it really was an accident. But I was too scared to dig deeper. I buried my locket in Emily's grave the day of her funeral, a final goodbye to our shared secret. I never thought I'd see it again. As Melissa's story unfolded, Sarah felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. The quaint town of Millbrook, with its picturesque streets and tight-knit community, suddenly seemed to harbor deeper, darker secrets than she had ever imagined. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Melissa straightened, a determined look replacing the sadness in her eyes. We finish what Emily started. We owe her that much. But we need to be careful. If there's any truth to my suspicions about her accident. Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. I know someone who might be able to help. Jake, my assistant manager. He used to work in digital forensics before moving to Millbrook. If there's anything on that microSD card, he'll be able to recover it. As if on cue, the cafe door opened, and Jake walked in, shaking snow from his coat. Sarah caught his eye, gesturing him over. Jake, she said, her voice low and serious. Remember how you once told me you missed the excitement of your old job? Well, I think we might have a case for you. Jake's eyes lit up with interest as Sarah and Melissa began to explain the situation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Millbrook in a soft, white silence. Across the street, Max made his way to Emily's grave, unaware that his faithful visits had set in motion a chain of events that would soon rock the foundations of the quiet town. As the three huddled together, their voices low and urgent, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. They were about to unearth a past that had long been buried, and she knew that nothing in Millbrook would ever be quite the same again. The following days in Millbrook were a whirlwind of covert activity. Sarah, Melissa, and Jake had transformed the cafe's back office into an impromptu investigation headquarters. They worked late into the nights, poring over the data recovered from the Lockett's microSD card, careful to maintain a facade of normalcy during business hours. Jake's expertise in digital forensics proved invaluable. He managed to decrypt most of the files, revealing a treasure trove of information about the art smuggling ring Emily had been investigating. There were photos of suspicious transactions, snippets of overheard conversations, and meticulously documented connections between seemingly unrelated parties. Emily was thorough, Jake murmured, scrolling through another batch of files. She managed to trace the operation back to someone local, someone with enough influence to coordinate international movements. Sarah and Melissa exchanged worried glances. The idea that someone in their tight-knit community could be involved in such a large-scale criminal operation was unsettling. "Any names?" Sarah asked, leaning over Jake's shoulder to peer at the screen. Jake shook his head. "Not yet. Emily used a lot of code names and abbreviations. It'll take time to decipher everything." As they delved deeper into Emily's investigation, Sarah found herself viewing her town through new eyes. Every interaction, every overheard conversation in the cafe, took on potential new meanings. She caught herself watching Mr. Johnson and Max during their daily visits to the cemetery, wondering if the old man knew more than he let on about his granddaughter's activities. One crisp morning, as Sarah was opening the cafe, she noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. Two men in suits stood nearby, their attention focused on the cemetery. Something about their stance and watchful demeanor set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. She casually made her way to the back office, where Jake was already working. "Jake," she whispered, "I think we might have company. There are two men outside who look like they're casing the place." Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the cafe's security camera feeds. "Good catch, Sarah," he said, his voice tense. "They definitely don't look like our usual crowd. We need to warn Melissa to lay low for a while." As if on cue, Melissa burst through the back door, her face flushed with excitement. "Guys, I think I've cracked it. I know who the local connection is." Sarah quickly shushed her, pointing to the security feed. Melissa's eyes widened as she took in the scene outside. "Oh no," she breathed. "They're here. We need to move fast." Jake turned to her, his expression serious. "Melissa, who is it? Who's behind all this?" Melissa took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mayor Fleming." Emily had proof that he's been using his position to facilitate the smuggling operations. His charitable art foundation? It's a front for moving stolen pieces in and out of the country. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Mayor Robert Fleming was a beloved figure in Millbrook, known for his generous contributions to local causes and his seemingly tireless efforts to promote the town's cultural scene. The idea that he could be involved in something so nefarious seemed almost impossible to believe. "We need to take this to the authorities," Sarah said, her mind racing. "But who can we trust? If the mayor's involved, who knows how far this goes?" Jake nodded grimly. "I have a contact in the FBI's art crime team. I can reach out to her, but we need to be careful. If Fleming gets wind of what we know, We could be in serious danger. As they huddled together, formulating a plan, a commotion outside caught their attention. On the security feed, they watched as Mr. Johnson approached the two suited men, Max faithfully by his side. The old man seemed to be confronting them, his usually stooped posture straight and defiant. "We need to help him," Sarah said, already moving towards the door. Jake caught her arm, holding her back. "Wait," he cautioned. "We don't know what's going on out there. If we rush in, we could make things worse." They watched, tension mounting, as the confrontation outside continued. To their surprise, the two men eventually backed down, returning to their car and driving away. Mr. Johnson stood watching them leave, Max alert at his side. Once the coast was clear, Sarah hurried out to meet Mr. Johnson. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Who were those men?" Mr. Johnson's weathered face was grim. "Trouble," he said simply. "But nothing new. They've been sniffing around ever since Emily." He trailed off, his eyes clouding with grief. Sarah made a split-second decision. "Mr. Johnson, I think you'd better come inside. There's something we need to talk about." Back in the cafe's office, Mr. Johnson listened silently as Sarah, Melissa, and Jake explained everything they had uncovered. When they finished, the old man let out a long, weary sigh. "I had my suspicions," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Emily, she tried to tell me, towards the end. But I didn't want to believe it. I thought she was just getting carried away with some wild conspiracy theory." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn envelope. "She gave me this, told me to keep it safe. Said if anything happened to her, I should give it to someone I trusted. I think it's time I passed it on." With trembling hands, he handed the envelope to Sarah. Inside, they found a USB drive and a handwritten note. Emily's final message to her grandfather read, "The truth is in the art. Look closely at the mayor's last donation to the town hall." Jake quickly plugged the USB drive into his computer. It contained a single video file, footage of Mayor Fleming engaging in what was clearly an illegal transaction, exchanging a painting for a briefcase full of cash. "This is it," Melissa breathed. "This is what Emily died for. We have to make this public." But Sarah hesitated. "We need to be smart about this," she cautioned. "If we just release the video, Fleming could claim it's doctored. We need more concrete evidence." Mr. Johnson nodded, a spark of his old determination lighting his eyes. "The painting," he said. "The one in the video. Fleming donated it to the town hall last year. It's hanging in the main foyer." Jake was already pulling up images on his computer. "Here," he said, pointing to a photo from the donation ceremony. "That's definitely the same painting from the video." Sarah felt a plan forming. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Here's what we're going to do." Over the next few hours, they put together a daring scheme. Jake would use his FBI contact to arrange for an art expert to examine the painting in the town hall. Sarah and Melissa would create a distraction during the next town council meeting, giving Mr. Johnson the opportunity to swap out the painting with a replica they would create. As night fell over Millbrook, the conspirators went their separate ways, each acutely aware of the risks they were taking. Sarah found herself unable to sleep, her mind replaying the day's events on an endless loop. In the early hours of the morning, she was startled by a soft scratching at her back door. Heart pounding, she cautiously approached, relaxing only when she recognized the familiar golden fur of Maximum. The dog whined softly, pawing at the door. When Sarah opened it, Max trotted in, dropping something at her feet. It was a small, cloth-wrapped package. With trembling fingers, Sarah unwrapped it, gasping when she saw what was inside. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box. On the lid was a message, burned into the wood in Emily's distinctive handwriting, "For Sarah, the final piece of the puzzle." As Sarah stared at the box, her mind whirling with questions, Max settled himself by her feet, his loyal eyes fixed on her face. In that moment, Sarah felt the weight of Emily's legacy settle firmly on her shoulders. Whatever secrets the box held, whatever dangers lay ahead, she knew that she would see this through to the end. The hidden truth was finally coming to light, and Sarah realized that her quiet life in Millbrook would never be the same again. But as she looked down at Max, his steadfast presence a comfort in the uncertain dawn, she felt a surge of determination. For Emily, for justice, for the truth, they would finish this, no matter the cost. The morning of the town council meeting dawned crisp and clear, a deceptive calm settling over Millbrook. Sarah stood behind the counter of her cafe, mechanically going through the motions of serving customers while her mind raced with the details of their plan. Every chime of the door made her heart skip a beat, half expecting to see Mayor Fleming or his mysterious suited associates walk in. Jake had set up a discreet surveillance system around the town hall, keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity. Melissa was stationed across the street, ready to create a diversion if needed. Mr. Johnson, looking more alert and determined than Sarah had seen him in years, sat at his usual table, Max lying faithfully at his feet. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself repeatedly touching the small wooden box Emily had left for her. She hadn't had a chance to open it yet, the events of the past few days leaving no time for careful examination. But its weight in her pocket was a constant reminder of what was at stake. At precisely 11:30 a.m., Sarah flipped the open sign to closed and nodded to Mr. Johnson. It was time. They made their way to the town hall, trying to look as casual as possible. Sarah clutched a large portfolio case containing the replica painting they had painstakingly created. As they approached the building, she saw Melissa across the street, giving them a subtle thumbs up. Inside the town hall, the usual pre-meeting bustle was in full swing. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the painting hanging in the foyer, the one they knew to be at the center of Mayor Fleming's illegal activities. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how many times she had walked past it, never suspecting its dark secret. Mr. Johnson made his way to the painting, ostensibly admiring it while surreptitiously checking for any security measures. Sarah hovered nearby, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside. Melissa had set their diversion in motion, staging a heated argument with a local shopkeeper right in front of the town hall steps. As curious onlookers and staff members rushed to see what was happening, Sarah and Mr. Johnson seized their chance. With surprising agility for his age, Mr. Johnson quickly removed the painting from the wall while Sarah unpacked the replica. In a matter of seconds, they had made the switch, and Mr. Johnson was carefully wrapping the original in a protective cloth. Just as they finished, Mayor Fleming's voice boomed through the foyer. "What's going on out there?" Sarah froze, the portfolio case feeling impossibly conspicuous in her hands. But Mr. Johnson, cool as could be, turned to the mayor with a grandfatherly smile. "Looks like a bit of a tiff outside, Robert. Nothing to worry about, I'm sure." Mayor Fleming's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the scene, Sarah with her large case, Mr. Johnson standing suspiciously close to the painting. For a moment, Sarah was sure they had been caught. But then the mayor's face relaxed into its usual affable expression. "Well, let's hope they sort it out quickly. We've got a meeting to start." With that, he strode into the council chamber, leaving Sarah and Mr. Johnson to exchange relieved glances. As the meeting began, Sarah slipped out of the town hall, the original painting safely concealed in her portfolio. She had just reached the bottom of the steps when a hand grabbed her arm, nearly making her drop the case. "Going somewhere, Miss Thompson?" Sarah turned to find herself face to face with one of the suited men she had seen watching the cemetery. His grip on her arm was firm, his eyes cold and calculating behind dark sunglasses. I was just heading back to the cafe," Sarah stammered, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We're short-staffed today." The man's lips curled into a humorless smile. "I think you'll want to come with me instead. The mayor would like a word." Sarah's mind raced, looking for a way out. Just then, a familiar bark echoed across the street. Max came bounding towards them, placing himself between Sarah and the suited man, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by a low, warning growl. The momentary distraction was all Sarah needed. She wrenched her arm free and took off running, Max close at her heels. She could hear shouts behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her feet pounded the pavement as she ran, her lungs burning with each breath. She rounded a corner, nearly colliding with Jake, who was emerging from an alley. "Sarah, "What's no time?" she gasped, grabbing his arm and pulling him along. "We've been made. We need to get the painting somewhere safe." Jake didn't hesitate. He led her down a series of back alleys, finally emerging near the old railroad station at the edge of town. An abandoned maintenance shed stood nearby, its padlock rusted and forgotten. With a few deft moves, Jake had the lock open, and they slipped inside. The shed was dusty and filled with old equipment, but it would serve as a temporary hiding place. As they caught their breath, Sarah quickly filled Jake in on what had happened. His face grew grim as he listened. "This is bad, Sarah. If Fleming knows we're onto him, he's going to move fast to cover his tracks." Sarah nodded, her mind whirling. "We need to get this painting to your FBI contact. It's our best piece of evidence." Jake was already pulling out his phone. "I'll make the call. But we can't stay here long. It won't take them long to search the town." As Jake stepped outside to make his call, Sarah finally had a moment to examine the wooden box Emily had left for her. With trembling fingers, she opened it, gasping at what she found inside. It contained a small USB drive, similar to the one Mr. Johnson had given them, and a handwritten note. The note read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means my suspicions were correct. This drive contains everything: names, dates, transactions. It's the key to bringing down the entire network. Be careful who you trust. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine. Good luck." Sarah's mind reeled at the implications. Just how big was this conspiracy? And how many people in Millbrook were involved? Her thoughts were interrupted by Jake's return. His face was pale, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "My FBI contact, she's not answering. And the last text I got from her was weird. Like it wasn't really her." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "You think they got to her?" Jake nodded slowly. "It's possible. Which means we can't trust the usual channels. We're on our own." The gravity of their situation began to sink in. They were alone in a small town, with evidence of a major international crime ring, and no idea who they could trust. The painting in Sarah's portfolio and the USB drive in her pocket suddenly felt like ticking time bombs. Just then, Max, who had been standing guard at the door, let out a low growl. Through the grimy window, Sarah could see several cars pulling up near the station, their occupants fanning out to search the area. "They found us," she whispered, her heart racing. Jake peered out, his expression hardening. "Not yet, they haven't. But we need to move. Now." As they prepared to make their escape, Sarah couldn't help but think of Emily. Had she felt this same mix of fear and determination when she first stumbled upon the truth? Had she known the danger she was putting herself in? Looking at Jake's resolute face and feeling the comforting presence of Max beside her, Sarah steeled herself for what was to come. They had uncovered the hidden truth, and now they were watching it unravel in the most dangerous way possible. But they had come too far to give up now. With a deep breath, Sarah clutched the portfolio and the wooden box close. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What's our next move?" Jake's eyes glinted with determination. "We need to get that evidence somewhere safe, and then we need to find someone we can trust. Someone with the power to bring this whole operation down." As they prepared to step back out into the fray, Sarah sent up a silent prayer, for Emily, for themselves, and for the truth they were fighting to reveal. The dangerous unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back now. The next few days in Millbrook were a whirlwind of activity that would forever change the face of the quiet town. Sarah, Jake, and their allies found themselves at the center of a storm that had been brewing for years, finally breaking with a fury that left no one untouched. Their daring escape from the abandoned railroad station had been just the beginning. With the painting and Emily's USB drive in their possession, they had managed to evade Mayor Fleming's men, thanks in large part to Max's uncanny ability to sense danger and lead them through little-known paths in the town's outskirts. They had found an unexpected ally in Sheriff Laura Hawkins, a recent transplant to Millbrook who had been quietly conducting her own investigation into some of the town's more suspicious activities. When Sarah and Jake had stumbled into her office, breathless and desperate, she had listened to their story with a growing look of grim satisfaction. "I knew something wasn't right in this town," she had said, her eyes glinting with determination. "But I never imagined it went this deep." With Sheriff Hawkins on their side, things had moved quickly. She had immediately contacted the state police and the FBI, bypassing local channels that might have been compromised. Within hours, Millbrook had been swarming with law enforcement officers, much to the bewilderment of its residents. The raid on Mayor Fleming's office and home had yielded a treasure trove of evidence, corroborating everything on Emily's USB drive and more. The painting from the town hall, when examined by art experts, was confirmed to be a masterpiece that had been stolen from a museum in Europe years ago. As news of the arrest spread, the town was plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. Mayor Fleming, the man who had been the face of Millbrook for over a decade, was led away in handcuffs, his expression a mix of rage and defeat. Several other prominent town figures were also implicated, their involvement in the smuggling ring sending ripples of dismay through the community. Sarah watched it all unfold with a sense of numbness. The cafe had become a hub of activity, with FBI agents coming and going, townspeople gathering to share their shock and speculate on what would happen next. She found herself making pot after pot of coffee, the familiar routine helping to ground her in the midst of the chaos. It was on the third day after the arrests that Mr. Johnson approached her, Max faithfully at his side. The old man's eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a peace in his expression that Sarah hadn't seen before. "I wanted to thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "For finishing what Emily started. For bringing the truth to light." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. I wish she could be here to see it." Mr. Johnson nodded, reaching down to pat Max's head. "In a way, I think she is. Through Max, through the clues she left behind. She knew someone would pick up where she left off." As the days turned into weeks, Millbrook began the slow process of healing and transformation. The town council, now minus several of its key members, struggled to maintain order and address the myriad of issues that had come to light. Special elections were called to fill the vacant positions, with a new emphasis on transparency and accountability. Sarah found herself thrust into a position of unexpected influence. Her role in uncovering the truth had made her something of a local hero, and many in the town were turning to her for guidance and leadership. It was a role she had never sought, but one she found herself embracing with a sense of responsibility to her community and to Emily's memory. The cafe became more than just a place for coffee and pastries. It transformed into a community center of sorts, where people gathered to discuss the changes happening in their town, to share their fears and hopes for the future. Sarah started hosting weekly town hall meetings, providing a platform for open dialogue and healing. Jake, with his background in digital forensics, was instrumental in helping the town upgrade its systems and implement new safeguards against corruption. He worked closely with Sheriff Hawkins to establish a citizen oversight committee, ensuring that power would never again be concentrated in the hands of a few. Melissa, inspired by Emily's dedication to justice, decided to stay in Millbrook. She used her experience in non-profit work to establish a foundation in Emily's name, dedicated to promoting transparency in local government and supporting young activists. As for Max, he became a symbol of loyalty and perseverance for the town. Mr. Johnson, with Sarah's help, started a program that brought Max to local schools, where children learned about Emily's bravery and the importance of standing up for what's right. The art world, too, felt the ripples of what had happened in Millbrook. As news of the smuggling ring spread, museums and collectors around the globe began re-examining their acquisitions. The scandal sparked a renewed global effort to combat art theft and protect cultural heritage. It was on a crisp autumn evening, almost a year to the day since Sarah had first noticed Max's daily visits to the cemetery, that she found herself standing before Emily's grave. The town had gathered for a memorial service, not just for Emily, but for the town Millbrook had been and the new community it was becoming. As Sarah looked out over the faces of her neighbors, some familiar, some new arrivals drawn by the town's story of redemption, she felt a profound sense of change and hope. Millbrook would never be the same quiet, unassuming town it had once been. But perhaps, she thought, that wasn't a bad thing. Mayor Fleming's trial was set to begin in a few months, promising to bring national attention back to their small town. But Sarah and the others were ready. They had weathered the storm of exposure and were emerging stronger, more united, and more committed to justice than ever before. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Sarah felt a familiar presence at her side. Max, grey now around the muzzle but still as loyal as ever, pressed against her leg. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, a smile tugging at her lips. "We did it, boy," she murmured. "We finished what Emily started." And as the town of Millbrook gathered around Emily's grave, sharing stories and reaffirming their commitment to the truth, Sarah knew that this was more than just an aftermath. It was a transformation, a rebirth. Millbrook had been tested, had faced its darkest secrets, and had emerged into the light. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still wounds to heal, systems to rebuild, trust to regain. But as Sarah looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, she felt a surge of determination. Together, they would write the next chapter of Millbrook's story, one of transparency, justice, and community. As the memorial service ended and people began to disperse, Sarah lingered for a moment at Emily's grave. She placed a single rose on the headstone, a promise and a thank you wrapped in one simple gesture. "Rest easy, Emily," she whispered. "Your fight is over. We'll take it from here." With Max at her side, Sarah turned and walked back towards the town, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun had set on Old Millbrook, but a new day was dawning, bright with possibility and hope. As the seasons changed and Millbrook settled into its new rhythm, Sarah found herself reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had transformed their quiet town. The crisp autumn air had given way to winter's chill, and now the first hints of spring were beginning to emerge, mirroring the town's own journey of renewal and growth. Sarah's Cafe, once a simple coffee shop, had evolved into the heart of the community. On this particular morning, as she wiped down the counter and prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't help but smile at the changes. The walls were now adorned with local artwork, each piece telling a story of Millbrook's history and its hopes for the future. A community bulletin board near the entrance was packed with flyers for town meetings, volunteer opportunities, and various initiatives born from the town's newfound spirit of engagement. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake walked in, his arms full of papers and his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Sarah," he called out, making his way to what had become his usual table. "Ready for the big day?" Sarah nodded, pouring him a cup of his favorite brew. "As ready as we'll ever be. Is everything set on your end?" Jake grinned, powering up his laptop. "You bet. The new town website goes live at noon. Complete transparency on all council meetings, budget allocations, and decision-making processes. Millbrook is about to become a model for small-town governance." As other regulars began to filter in, Sarah felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. There was Tom, the former groundskeeper, now heading up a youth mentorship program. Melissa chatted animatedly with a group of high school students, discussing plans for the upcoming Emily Richardson Memorial Scholarship fundraiser. Even Mr. Johnson, who had once been a quiet fixture in the cafe, was now actively engaged in conversation, sharing stories of Emily with anyone who would listen. The door chimed again, and Sheriff Hawkins entered, looking sharp in her dress uniform. "Today's the day," she said, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah. "The governor's going to have a field day with this one." Sarah nodded, her excitement tinged with a hint of nervousness. In just a few hours, Millbrook would be hosting the governor and a slew of reporters for the official unveiling of the Millbrook Model, a comprehensive plan for small-town reform that had grown out of their experiences over the past year. As the morning wore on, Sarah found moments to chat with her customers, each conversation a reminder of how far they'd come. Mrs. Peterson, once known only for her daily muffin order, was now heading a community garden initiative. "We're thinking of expanding to a full farmers market this summer," she said proudly. "Bring some life back to that old lot behind the town hall." By mid-morning, the cafe was buzzing with excitement. Sarah had closed early the day before to rearrange the space, creating room for a small podium and media area. As she watched Jake and a few volunteers setting up cameras and microphones, she felt a tug on her apron. Looking down, she saw Max, his muzzle now completely grey but his eyes as bright as ever. "Hey there, old friend," she said softly, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "Ready for your big moment?" Max's tail wagged in response, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh. The loyal dog had become something of a local celebrity, with many crediting his persistent cemetery visits as the catalyst that had set everything in motion. He was to be honored today alongside the human heroes of Millbrook's transformation. As noon approached, the cafe filled to capacity. The governor arrived with her entourage, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the townspeople. Sarah watched from behind the counter, still somewhat awed by the attention their small town was receiving. "Quite a change from a year ago, isn't it?" a familiar voice said. Sarah turned to see Mr. Johnson standing beside her, Max faithfully at his feet. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I just wish Emily could see this," she said softly. Mr. Johnson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She can, Sarah. In every positive change we've made, in every life we've touched, Emily's spirit lives on." The ceremony began with Sheriff Hawkins introducing the governor, who spoke eloquently about Millbrook's journey from corruption to a beacon of transparency and community engagement. As Sarah listened, she felt a swell of pride for her town and the people who had come together to make this change possible. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah approached the podium with a mix of nervousness and determination. Looking out at the sea of familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and allies who had stood with her through the darkest days, she felt her anxiety melt away. A little over a year ago, she began, her voice steady, "Millbrook was a town with secrets. We thought we knew who we were, but we had no idea of the corruption that was eating away at our foundation. It took the bravery of one young woman, Emily Richardson, and the persistence of her four-legged friend, Max, to set us on the path to truth." As she spoke, Sarah recounted the journey they had all taken together, the discovery of the art smuggling ring, the danger they had faced, and the difficult process of rebuilding trust within the community. She talked about the lessons they had learned and the systems they had put in place to ensure that power could never again be abused in their town. "But the Millbrook model isn't just about preventing corruption," Sarah continued, her passion evident in every word. "It's about active citizenship, about each of us taking responsibility for the health and future of our community. It's about fostering an environment where questions are encouraged, where transparency is the norm, and where every voice is heard." As she concluded her speech, Sarah looked down at Max, who sat proudly at the base of the podium. "And so, as we move forward into this new chapter of our town's history, let us remember the courage it took to get here. Let us honor those who risked everything for the truth. And let us commit, every day, to being the kind of community that would make Emily proud." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the cafe and spilling out onto the street where more townspeople had gathered. As Sarah stepped back, she felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and unity. The rest of the day passed in a blur of interviews, handshakes, and congratulations. As evening fell and the last of the reporters packed up their equipment, Sarah found herself alone in the cafe, save for Jake, Melissa, Mr. Johnson, and Maximum. "Well," Jake said, raising a cup of coffee in a toast, "here's to Millbrook 2.0. They all laughed, the sound filled with relief, pride, and a touch of lingering disbelief at all they had accomplished. As they sat together, sharing stories and planning for the future, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would not be without its challenges. There were still wounds to heal, systems to refine, and a constant vigilance to maintain. But looking around at her friends, at the transformed space of her cafe, and at the town beyond its windows, Sarah knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Max, sensing the shift in mood, got up and nudged Sarah's hand. She smiled down at him, remembering that fateful day when she had first noticed his cemetery visits. "Ready for a walk, boy?" she asked. Together, the small group left the cafe, stepping out into the cool evening air. As they walked through the town streets, Sarah marveled at the changes both big and small. The town hall, once a symbol of corruption, now stood proudly with a new transparency garden out front, funded by the sale of the recovered stolen artwork. The old railroad station was being renovated into a community center, its walls already brightened by murals depicting Millbrook's history and rebirth. Their walk took them, as it so often did, to the cemetery. Standing before Emily's grave, now adorned with fresh flowers and small tokens of remembrance from grateful townspeople, they stood in comfortable silence. "You know," Melissa said softly, "I think this is just the beginning. What we've done here in Millbrook, It could inspire other towns, other communities. Jake nodded enthusiastically. I've already had inquiries from a few neighboring counties about implementing similar systems. Emily would have loved that, Mr. Johnson said, his voice thick with emotion. She always believed that one person could make a difference, that standing up for what's right could change the world. As the sun set on Millbrook, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had turned a scandal into an opportunity for growth, transformed a tragedy into a force for positive change. And while the journey had been difficult, the destination was worth every hardship. To new beginnings, Sarah said softly, her words carried on the gentle evening breeze. And as Max barked cheerfully in response, his tail wagging, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Millbrook would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before.